There are moments in television history that never made it to air. Moments scrubbed from memory, buried in vaults, whispered about only in green rooms long after midnight. This is one of them. It happened on a Tuesday, March 17th, 1972, St. Patrick's Day. The Tonight Show was taping as usual, Studio One at NBC Burbank, humming with that particular energy that only comes from 300 people waiting to laugh on command. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, tie perfectly knotted, smile practiced to the millimeter. The guest that night was supposed to be Lightfair, a Vegas entertainment director named Mitchell Banks, brought on to talk about the new Caesars Palace expansion and maybe tell a few Rat Pack stories that had been sanitized for Middle America. But something was wrong. Johnny could feel it the moment he walked into the building that afternoon. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, who had worked with him since the show moved to California, met him at his dressing room door with a face that had gone pale under her makeup. "There's someone here," she said. "We have 300 someones here, Dorothy. That's generally how this works." "Not in the audience." Johnny paused, one hand on the doorknob. "Where?" "Security office. He won't leave. Says he needs to see you before the show." "Name?" Dorothy handed him a business card. It was cream-colored, expensive stock, no company name, just a phone number and a single name embossed in black, Paul Lansky. Johnny's fingers went cold. He slipped the card into his jacket pocket and smiled at Dorothy. The same smile he gave America every night, the one that said everything was fine, everything was always fine. "Tell him I'm in makeup. Can't be disturbed." "I did. He said he'll wait." "Then let him wait." But Johnny didn't go into his dressing room. He stood in the hallway for a full minute, breathing slowly, counting the tiles on the floor. 7 across, 12 down. 84 tiles between him and a door he didn't want to walk through. The thing about Johnny Carson that most people never understood was this: his greatest skill wasn't comedy. It was control. He controlled the room, controlled the conversation, controlled the America that tuned in every night at 11:30, expecting him to make sense of a world that increasingly made none. He'd built an empire on that control, a kingdom of calm in the chaos of late-night television. But control only works when you know the variables. And Paul Lansky was not a variable Johnny had accounted for. The name Lansky carried weight in certain circles. Meyer Lansky, Paul's father, was a ghost who walked through walls, a man who had turned organized crime into organized business. He didn't wear pinstripe suits and carry Tommy guns. He wore respectability like armor. By 1972, he was 70 years old, living in semi-exile in Israel, fighting extradition, and still, his name could make phone lines go dead and meetings get canceled. Johnny had met Meyer Lansky exactly once. It was 1965, 7 years earlier. Johnny was still new to The Tonight Show, still learning how to navigate the peculiar ecosystem of fame that existed where Hollywood met Las Vegas. A mutual friend, Johnny never remembered who, or perhaps he chose not to, arranged a dinner at the Sands. Private room. Just the two of them and a bottle of scotch that probably cost more than Johnny's first car. Meyer had been polite, almost grandfatherly. They talked about baseball, about Eisenhower, about the nature of entertainment and why people needed to laugh. Meyer never mentioned his business. Johnny never asked. But at the end of the night, Meyer said something that Johnny had filed away in the part of his brain where he kept things he didn't want to examine too closely. "You have a gift, Mr. Carson. You make people trust you. That's rarer than you think. Protect it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't advice. It was an observation. But Johnny heard the subtext. "We see you. We know what you have. Don't waste it. Don't abuse it." Johnny never took money from anyone connected to Meyer Lansky, never did favors, never mentioned the meeting to anyone, not even his producer. He simply filed it away and moved forward, careful never to make jokes about certain topics, never to book certain guests, never to wander into territory that might bring a phone call he didn't want to receive. And for 7 years, it worked. But now Paul Lansky was sitting in NBC's security office, and Johnny had a show to tape in 90 minutes. The security office smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Paul Lansky sat in a plastic chair with the posture of a man who had never waited for anything in his life, but was willing to make an exception. He was 41 years old, dressed in a tailored suit that whispered money without shouting it. His face was his father's face, softened slightly by good living and American comfort. When Johnny entered, Paul stood, not quickly, not deferentially, just stood. Mr. Carson, Mr. Lansky. They didn't shake hands. Johnny glanced at the security guard, who suddenly found something fascinating about his clipboard. "Give us a minute." The guard left. The door clicked shut. The room felt smaller. "I'll be direct," Paul said. "My father heard his name on your show." Johnny's mind raced backward through weeks of monologues, jokes, ad-libs, nothing. He'd been so careful. When? Last Thursday. You made a joke about Las Vegas, about how all the hotels were built with investments from concerned citizens. You got a big laugh. Johnny remembered. It had been a throwaway line, nothing special. The audience loved it because it felt dangerous without actually being dangerous. That was the trick. Imply everything, state nothing. "It was a joke about architecture," Johnny said evenly. "It was a joke about my father." "I never mentioned your father. You didn't have to." Paul stepped closer, not threatening, just closer. "Mr. Carson, do you know why my father liked you? I wasn't aware he did. He told me once that you were smart, that you knew where the lines were, that you understood how things work." Paul's voice was quiet, almost gentle. He respected that. Respected. Past tense. Paul let that hang in the air for 3 full seconds. He's in Tel Aviv right now, fighting extradition, listening to American radio broadcasts, and he hears Johnny Carson making jokes about concerned citizens building Vegas. He hears his life's work reduced to a punchline. Johnny felt his jaw tighten. "Your father built his life on choices. I built mine on jokes. Sometimes they intersect. And sometimes intersections cause accidents." There it was. Not a threat. Not quite. But the shape of one, hovering in the space between words. Johnny looked at Paul Lansky and saw exactly what he needed to see. A son protecting a father's legacy. A man caught between two worlds, trying to honor something that couldn't be honored in daylight. And in that moment, Johnny made a calculation. The same kind of calculation he made every night when he decided which joke to tell, which guest to needle, which laugh to chase. "I'll be more careful," Johnny said. Paul nodded slowly. "That's all we ask. Careful." "We? My father has friends, Mr. Carson, people who believe in loyalty, in reciprocity." Paul moved toward the door, then paused. "You have a daughter, don't you?" Every molecule in Johnny's body went still. "2 sons." "Right. Sons." Paul smiled, a smile that contained no warmth, no humor, just acknowledgement. Easy to get details wrong, important to get them right. Then he left. Johnny stood alone in the security office, listening to his own heartbeat, counting the seconds until he had to walk onto a stage and make 300 people laugh. 73 seconds. The Tonight Show theme music hit like it always did, bright, brassy, relentlessly cheerful. The audience applauded on cue. Ed McMahon delivered his introduction with the same booming enthusiasm he'd been perfecting for a decade, and Johnny Carson walked through the curtain, waving, smiling, utterly in control. He delivered the monologue without a single stumble. The jokes landed, the rhythms held. By all observable metrics, it was a perfectly normal show. But Dorothy, watching from the wings, saw something nobody else could see. Johnny's left hand, resting on his desk between bits, was trembling. The guest segment began. Mitchell Banks walked out, a tanned, affable man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years in Vegas entertainment and had seen everything worth seeing and plenty that wasn't. He and Johnny fell into easy banter about lounge acts and showgirls and the peculiar architecture of excess that defined the Strip. Then Banks said something that changed the temperature of the room. "You know, Johnny, people always ask me how these places get built. Like, where does all that money come from?" Banks laughed, comfortable, clueless. "I tell them, don't ask questions you don't want answered." The audience laughed. Johnny laughed, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. "That's probably good advice for most of life," Johnny said, steering away. But Banks, riding the energy of the room, pushed forward. "I mean, you look at Caesars, the Sands, all these palaces. Someone had vision, right? Someone had to believe. And capital," Johnny added quietly. "Oh, sure, but I'm talking about the real visionaries, the guys who saw what Vegas could be before anyone else." Banks leaned in, conspiratorial. "Meyer Lansky, for instance. Now there's a—" Johnny's earpiece crackled. The director's voice cut through. "We've got movement backstage. Security issue. Johnny's hand shot up, cutting Banks off mid-sentence. Actually, Mitchell, I want to hear about the new Caesars show. The one with the elephants? Banks blinked, confused by the redirect, but trained enough to follow. Oh, sure. The elephants are incredible. We brought them from... But Johnny wasn't listening. His eyes had drifted to the wings, stage left, where a figure had appeared in the shadows. Tall, still, watching. The stage manager made a cutting motion across his throat. Commercial break. 30 seconds. Johnny smiled at the camera. We'll be right back with more from Mitchell Banks and possibly some tap-dancing elephants. Who knows? Anything can happen. The red light died. The stage went dark. And Johnny Carson stood up from his desk for the first time in Tonight Show history before a commercial break was actually over. Stay here, he told Banks. What's... But Johnny was already moving. The man in the wings wasn't Paul Lansky. He was older, heavier, with the kind of face that had seen too many late nights and early mornings. He wore a security badge that looked legitimate enough until you looked closely and saw it was from the wrong studio. Mr. Carson, the man said, we need to talk. We're in the middle of a show. I know, that's why I now is good. Two stagehands had materialized, sensing trouble. The floor director was speaking urgently into his headset. And somewhere in the control booth, a producer was making a decision about whether to extend the commercial break. Johnny looked at this stranger, this intruder, and felt something he almost never felt, genuine uncertainty. Who are you? A friend of Paul's. He wanted me to deliver something. The man reached into his jacket. Every security guard in the building tensed. What came out was an envelope, plain, white, unsealed. He said you'd understand. Johnny took the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, slightly faded, from 1965. The Sands Hotel, a private dining room. Meyer Lansky and Johnny Carson, raising glasses in a toast that nobody was supposed to remember. Johnny stared at the photograph for 5 full seconds. Then he looked up at the stranger. What does he want? Nothing. Just wanted you to know, some things don't stay buried just because we stop talking about them. The commercial break was ending. 15 seconds. The stage manager was frantically signaling. Johnny pocketed the photograph and walked back to his desk, his face betraying nothing, his hands steady now because they had to be. Mitchell Banks sat exactly where Johnny had left him, confused but professional. The red light came on. We're back, Johnny said, and his voice sounded exactly like it always did, warm, controlled, safe. Mitchell was just telling us about elephants. The show ended at its regular time. The audience filed out, satisfied, having witnessed nothing unusual. Ed McMahon clapped Johnny on the shoulder and made plans for golf on Thursday. The crew broke down the set with the efficient rhythm of people who had done this 4,000 times before, and Johnny Carson sat alone in his dressing room, staring at a photograph from 7 years ago, trying to remember exactly what he and Meyer Lansky had talked about that night. Baseball, Eisenhower, entertainment, trust. Dorothy knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. She'd earned that right somewhere around show number 500. You okay? Fine. Johnny? He looked up. What did security say about the guy backstage? They're still trying to figure out how he got in. His badge was a fake. Decent fake, but fake. Get me his name. They didn't get it. He was gone before they could. Then get me something. Johnny's voice had an edge Dorothy had rarely heard. I want to know who he was, who sent him, and how he knew exactly when to show up. Dorothy nodded and left. The door clicked shut. Johnny pulled out the photograph again. He remembered now. Meyer had asked him about trust, about whether Johnny thought America still trusted its institutions, its leaders, its entertainers. Johnny had said something flip, probably some joke about trust being easier when you're selling laughs instead of politics. And Meyer had smiled, that patient smile of someone who knew things Johnny didn't, and said, Trust is a currency, Mr. Carson. Spend it wisely. Once it's gone, you can't earn it back. At the time, Johnny thought Meyer was talking about himself, about a reputation built on fear disguised as respect. Now, holding this photograph, Johnny understood differently. Meyer Lansky had been warning him. 3 days passed. The photograph stayed in Johnny's desk drawer, hidden under scripts and fan mail and meaningless memos. He didn't show it to anyone. Didn't mention Paul Lansky's visit to his producer or his lawyer or even Dorothy, who who knew most of his secrets by virtue of being close enough to see them. On Friday night, after another perfectly executed show, Johnny drove home to his Bel Air house and poured himself a scotch he didn't want but needed. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. He almost didn't answer. "Hello, Mr. Carson." The voice was older now, worn thin by distance and years, but unmistakable. "It's been a long time." Johnny sat down slowly. "Mr. Lansky, you spoke with my son." "I did." "I apologize for his enthusiasm. Paul sometimes forgets that not everything requires a personal touch." Meyer's breathing was audible over the line, shallow, labored. "I'm calling to tell you that the matter is closed. No action required. No debt incurred." Johnny gripped the phone tighter. "Then why send the photograph?" A long pause. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, an old man was choosing his words carefully. "Because I wanted you to remember that we had a conversation once about trust, about protecting the gift you have." Meyer coughed, wet and painful. "My son thinks I'm angry about a joke. He's wrong. I understand jokes, Mr. Carson. I understand that comedy requires edges, and edges sometimes cut." "Then what?" "I'm calling because I'm dying." Meyer said it flatly, without drama. "Lung cancer. Maybe 6 months if I'm lucky, maybe 6 weeks if I'm not. And when you're dying, you think about the things you tried to teach people, and whether they listened." Johnny closed his eyes. "I'm listening now." "I know. That's why I called." Another pause. "You're going to be offered things, Mr. Carson, opportunities that seem harmless, money that seems clean, friendships that seem genuine, and most of it will be exactly that, harmless, clean, genuine. But not all of it, and the trick is knowing the difference." "How do you tell the difference?" Meyer Lansky laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "If you have to ask, you already know." The line went quiet for so long that Johnny thought they'd been disconnected. "Mr. Lansky." "I'm here, just thinking." Another breath. "The photograph Paul gave you, burn it. Don't keep evidence of conversations that never happened. Don't carry weight that isn't yours." "Why tell me this?" "Because you're good at what you do. And the world needs people who are good at things, who do them honestly, who don't compromise for convenience." Meyer's voice softened. "My father, my real father, the one who came from Poland with nothing, used to say that a man's reputation is the only thing he owns that can't be stolen, only given away. I'll remember that. I hope you do." Another cough. "Goodbye, Mr. Carson. Mr. Lansky." But the line was dead. Johnny sat in his empty house, holding a silent phone, staring at a glass of scotch that had gone warm in his hand. Outside, Los Angeles sprawled in all directions, 10 million people living 10 million separate lives, most of them unaware that Johnny Carson existed beyond their television screens. He wondered how many of them carried secrets that weighed this much. He wondered how many of them burned photographs at midnight. Johnny built the fire in his backyard fireplace, something he rarely used because Los Angeles nights were rarely cold enough to justify it. But tonight, he needed to watch something burn completely, needed to see paper turn to ash and ash turn to nothing. The photograph curled at the edges first. Meyer Lansky's face darkened, then disappeared. Johnny's own face followed, swallowed by flame until there was nothing left but carbon and memory. He stood there until the fire died down to embers, then poured water over the ashes to be certain. When Dorothy asked him on Monday morning if everything was all right, Johnny smiled and told her everything was fine. When his producer asked if he wanted to book more Vegas entertainment directors, Johnny said yes, but maybe give it a few months. When Ed McMahon mentioned over drinks that someone had been asking questions about Johnny's old Vegas connections, Johnny changed the subject and made a note to be more careful about who he had drinks with. The Tonight Show continued. The ratings stayed strong. America kept tuning in at 11:30, expecting Johnny to make sense of the world, and Johnny kept delivering exactly what they expected: controlled chaos, safe danger, laughter that felt rebellious without actually rebelling against anything. But sometimes, late at night, after the show wrapped and the audience went home, Johnny would sit in his dressing room and think about trust, about currency, about the difference between a joke and a judgment. And sometimes he wondered if Meyer Lansky had been right, if trust really was something you could only spend once, and if he'd already spent more of it than he realized. Meyer Lansky died on January 15, 1983, nearly 11 years after that phone call. Johnny read about it in the newspaper over breakfast. The obituary was surprisingly respectful. Financial genius of the underworld, the headline called him. They mentioned the gambling, the Cuba connections, the decades of investigation that never quite produced an indictment that stuck. They didn't mention a dinner at the Sands in 1965. They didn't mention a phone call in 1972. They didn't mention the thousand small decisions Johnny had made over the years, guests he didn't book, jokes he didn't tell, questions he didn't ask. Johnny folded the newspaper carefully and finished his coffee. That night, he did his monologue as usual. He made jokes about Reagan, about the economy, about the weather. He interviewed an actress promoting a forgettable film and a comedian with a new album. He never mentioned Meyer Lansky. But after the show, he sat alone in his dressing room, something he'd been doing more often lately, and thought about the cost of control, about what you give up when you decide to protect something, about whether safety is worth the price of silence. Dorothy found him there an hour after everyone else had gone home. "You're going to miss Carson," she said. It was what she always said when he stayed too late, a reference to the person he became on camera versus the person he was everywhere else. "Maybe Carson should miss me once in a while," Johnny said. Dorothy didn't ask what he meant. She'd learned, over the years, that some of Johnny's comments weren't meant to be understood, just acknowledged. "There's a bottle of decent scotch in my desk," she said. "Top drawer, behind the aspirin. Lock up when you leave." Then she was gone, and Johnny was alone with his thoughts and a bottle of scotch that had been there for emergencies he'd never defined. He poured 2 fingers into a coffee mug and raised it to the empty room. "To trust," he said to nobody, "and to knowing when to spend it." The scotch tasted like smoke and regret and relief all at once. In 1992, Johnny Carson walked away from The Tonight Show after 30 years. He gave a final monologue that was graceful and brief and utterly controlled, exactly what everyone expected. He thanked the audience, thanked his crew, thanked Ed McMahon, and then he was gone, replaced by Jay Leno and later by others who tried to fill a space that couldn't quite be filled. Reporters asked him, in the years that followed, about his time in television, about the guests he remembered, the moments that stood out, the secrets of maintaining success for 3 decades in an industry that chewed people up and spit them out before their contracts dried. Johnny always answered politely, always mentioned the writers, the crew, the importance of timing, always deflected personal questions with jokes that felt like answers but weren't. Nobody ever asked him about Meyer Lansky. Nobody ever asked him about trust. And Johnny never volunteered the information, because some stories aren't meant to be told, only carried. He died in 2005, quietly, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see the industry he'd helped define transform into something he barely recognized. In the obituaries, they called him the king of late night. They mentioned the Karnak sketches, the animal segments, the way he'd made America laugh through Vietnam and Watergate, and the anxious drift of the 1970s. They didn't mention a photograph burned in a backyard fireplace. They didn't mention a phone call from Tel Aviv. They didn't mention the night Paul Lansky came to Studio One and Johnny Carson learned the difference between fear and respect. Because that story, the real story, existed in the space between what was said and what was understood. In the silence after a joke that went too far. In the careful edit that kept certain names out of monologues. In the 1,000 tiny compromises that looked like cowardice from one angle and wisdom from another. Johnny understood, in the end, what Meyer Lansky had tried to teach him. That every choice has a weight, every word has a consequence, and the art of survival isn't about never being afraid. It's about knowing what you're afraid of, and deciding, in the moment when it matters most, whether that fear serves you or owns you. There's a vault somewhere in NBC's archives where they keep the recordings that never aired, the segments that went wrong, the jokes that bombed, the technical failures, and human disasters that punctuate any long-running show. Somewhere in that vault is a tape from March 17, 1972. It's labeled "Technical Difficulties Do Not Archive," in handwriting that doesn't match any current employee's signature. The tape itself is exactly 30 seconds long, the duration of a commercial break that got extended for reasons the log doesn't specify. If you played that tape, which nobody has in 50 years, you would see Johnny Carson standing in the wings of his own show, talking to a man who shouldn't have been there. You would see Johnny's face in the moment before he remembered to control it. You would see something honest and unguarded and utterly unlike the Johnny Carson that America knew. But nobody plays that tape, because some moments are too true to be preserved, and some truths are too expensive to be free. Johnny understood that. Meyer understood that. And in the end, understanding was enough.